Hey, it's Benoit, this is ZOAR Fitness, and today I want to talk about 6 different types of intervals. So rather than this video sort of being going over like the art and science of program design and going over all the different examples and like having an exhaustive list, that's really not the goal here. The goal is really just to spark your ideas and to get you to think in some different unique ways. So our first type of interval is an on-off interval. So this is the most traditional style of interval. For example, it could be 10 times of a 1-minute row and 1-minute rest. So it's really simple, and oftentimes people get kind of boxed into the work-rest ratios they use this. So this is actually much more versatile than people realize, where it could be a sprint as an on-off if the work to rest is very low, or it could be a large, like really endurance stimulus if you move it to the other end of things. So it's pretty versatile depending on how you actually use it, but that's our first type, is that traditional interval. So then our second style of interval is high-low intervals. So rather than being on and off like that binary like we did in the first one, now it's high and low, where you never actually stop moving during that recovery period. So for example, it could be 10 times of that 1-minute row, but now we're rowing for a minute at a recovery pace between each of those hard intervals. So it might be like your 5K time trial pace for one, and then on your other one, it might be like your 5K time trial pace plus 10 or 15 seconds. So it's a much easier pace. And again, this is really about, can you actually clear fatigue while you're still moving? So not just when you stop and you're able to breathe naturally and uninhibited, but as you're actually continuing to move, are you able to clear fatigue as you're doing that? And that's really the biggest use of high-low intervals. So then our third style of interval is cyclical cluster sets. So for example, it could be 4 sets of a 20.20.20 calorie row. So each one of those 20.20. So that's a cluster set. So it's a shorter rest in between each of those clusters, so that you get a quick break, but not enough to fully recover, so that you can maintain a really high pace. And then after a certain number of sets or a certain number of clusters, you take a longer break before that next set. This is super useful. I mean, you'll see this in use in weightlifting in terms of like strength work, but this is also useful as a cyclical modality. For number one, it's just easier mentally as an athlete to be able to break that up and think like, oh yeah, I only have to take care of these 3 small sets at a time, rather than thinking of it as 12 total sets. But the other thing that allows for is you to maintain a higher pace and a higher output for that athlete, and then they get a short break and they able to repeat that, and then they get that longer break to be able to fully recover. So it's a really useful thing, and then you can start to progress this where it's the closer you get to maybe like a time trial event, you can start to build that out. Instead of 20 and 20 and 20, it could be like 30.30 for calories, where you're starting to push that together, and maybe then you go into like a 60 calorie time trial. So it's just another way to start to build confidence for your athletes. So then our fourth style of interval is descending intervals. So descending in terms of the distance that you're covering or the time domain that you're doing in each set. So for example, it could be like 1,500 meter row, 1,250 meter row, 1,000, 750, and then 500 meters. And there's really 2 different ways you could do this, where you're keeping the same pace the entire time. So for example, maybe it's your 5K time trial pace minus 1 to 3 seconds, so just faster than your 5K. And then you're having that set rest time between. So initially it's going to start harder because you're having to do a bigger chunk of the work, and then you have to maintain that as you're going through those consecutive sets. Or you could do it where you keep that same rest time between, but rather you're trying to descend in your pace throughout those latter sets. So this is where you start off and it's a little bit easier, but you're doing a little bit more work in terms of duration. And then as you get deeper into the workout, you get more rest relative to the work that you're doing, but then you have to hold a higher pace on your work. And again, this is just another way to manipulate that work rest across that time domain. So then our fifth style of interval is ascending intervals. So which is basically just the mirror opposite of descending intervals. So for example, it could be row 500 meters, 750, 1K, 1,200 meters, and then 1,500 meters as an example. So if you're someone who's holding that fixed pace, so for example, that 5K time trial pace minus 1 to 3 seconds, then it's gonna be something where it's pretty easy initially, and then as you get deeper into that workout, you're doing more and more and bigger chunks of the work. So it's gonna be much more stressful at the end of the workout. And the beginning part of the workout is almost like a built-in warm-up. Or you could do it where you structure it where it's go out faster at like a hard pace on the 500 meters, and then your pace is going to drop across those sets, but then your total work that you get in is gonna be higher, but also the stress of that workout is gonna be higher because it's going to be, basically you're spending more time closer to like your red line in the much bigger part of that workout. So it's something that will mimic competition a lot more, but it's also something that's gonna be a lot more stressful for that athlete. So then our sixth and final type of interval is ramp up intervals. So example of this could be 4 sets, and you're going to start at a 2:15 pace per 500 meters, and you're going to, every 500 meters, increase that pace by 5 seconds. So you go 2:15, 2:10, 2:05, 2 minutes, and you're gonna keep that pattern descending in your pace until you fail. Then you'll rest maybe 7 or 8 out of recovery, and then you're going to repeat that for 4 total sets, or however many you choose to do. So there's a couple different things you can manipulate here. Number one is how fast you are starting off. I'd recommend starting pretty slow for the most part, and then building progressively. But then how quickly you choose to build is another factor that you can change. So for example, you could increase your pace 15 seconds every 500 meters, and it would get dramatically tougher quicker, and you'd fail at a much sooner point. So you'd be doing less total work and be more on the power end of the spectrum, a little bit less on the endurance end of things. One of the big things that's an advantage to this is that you're starting easy, so it's giving your heart time to basically get to the point where it's having its maximum cardiac output, where it's really stimulating the heart to create as much output as it possibly can, and that's the point where you're then going to fail shortly after that. Obviously, you get to rest and let your heart rate come back down, let the fatigue clear, and then you repeat that process again. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And as always, head to ZOARfitness.com for movement breakdowns and programming for the sport of fitness.